supported by the Temasek Emergency Preparedness Fund managed by the Temasek Foundation. So thank you very much for our partner over here who has been allowing us to actually support us to put forth these programs. Okay, so I think for audience who are with us for, we have been doing this for quite a while. So for audience who are with us for quite a while, pardon us, for audience who are new to us, just allow us to have a couple of minutes to run through a little bit of this series. So like I mentioned, my name is Yin Ning. So who exactly I am? I am a family therapist with Viria Community Services, and together with me, like I said, there's Ting Ting. She's also a therapist at Viria Therapy Center. This series that we're going to bring forth for you is on relationship violence. The key objective that we are looking at by bringing forth this topic, which is very close to our heart, because we do see a lot of members of the public actually having a lot of differing thoughts about what relationship violence is. We thought we want to take this opportunity to share with you to create awareness of relationship violence, and hopefully if let's say you do know of anyone, including yourself, who might be having challenges in this area of work, we hope that you'll be able to recognize and understand what relationship violence is all about, and more importantly, from this awareness, that we are able to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe from abusive relationship. Okay, so this, we're going to spend an hour together over here. The format will be very, very similar, and kind of that's where I will kind of share a little bit about the next week, kind of a little bit of prelude for next week. For the first two sessions, we're going to do a lot more of sharing with all of you on the topic. Hopefully with that, it will allow you to have a enhanced understanding of what is relationship violence. But what's going to happen next week, the format will be a bit different. So if you do have any big questions for us, maybe stay tuned for the next week series. Next week, what's going to be different is instead of a Tuesday evening, it will be on a Wednesday evening on the 16th of December. We're going to have a session called a special dialogue. During that session, we're going to uncover some of the myths that people tend to have about domestic or relationship violence. But more importantly, at the same time, we hope to have a more intimate, kind of like more interactive sessions where some of you can actually pose situations that maybe you want us to discuss a little bit more in depth about, because I think what's going to happen for today's session as well is a lot of sharing of information. We'll definitely answer the questions, but maybe the way that we answer the questions might be a little bit more from the superficial, if I were to put it that way. We will not be able to go too in depth because of the nature of the presentation. So if you do have any scenarios that you'd like us to discuss, feel free to stay tuned with us for next week's session. We'll give a little bit more information later on. So just now, I think Ashley has also helped me to click the recording button. So for training purposes, all sessions are actually recorded. Feel free to leave out your video if you do not want us to record your visual. And at the same time, just now, I've also shared that we would like to be able to respond to as many questions as you can. So pop in your questions on the chat box. But however, with that said, we'd like to remind everyone to be respectful. If you do want to comment on one another's questions or feedback, feel free to do so. Let's just make sure that we do use respective language. Otherwise, we may have to have you excuse yourself in terms of changing the language that you're using. Okay, so all these are more of housekeeping. Let's head to our session, because like I mentioned, we kind of have quite a heavy session today as we talk about two key areas for this evening. For this evening, the first thing that we'd like to cover, I'll be having the first half of the session with support from Ting Ting, of course. We're going to look at what are some of the contributing factors in abusive relationship. So later on, Ting Ting will be coming in to help us to tie back to today's theme of how do we break out of violence? How do you keep yourself and your loved ones safe from abusive relationship, from violence? Okay. So I think for audience who have joined us last session, this slide is not new. We kind of talked about it last week, but because it is such an important area, which we found ourselves having to repeatedly work with people in abusive relationship, that we really want to highlight this. So please allow me to maybe spend a couple of minutes to emphasize, no matter what we're going to share, I think one key area that we'd like everyone to be able to give it a little bit more thought is how violence is never okay. The impact of violence, many, in my course of working with many people who might be in abusive relationships, sometimes very commonly I hear people say, okay, it's just a slap, she didn't get injured. I did not hurt her. I said that to scare her. I also hear families where their children, where they get to witness couples fighting. I hear parents telling me they are too young to be affected. Last session, we kind of talked about the impact of violence. So I think what we want to emphasize over here is it's not so much about what mode of violence, what's the nature of the violence, but the impact are very, very real. There's short-term impact and there's long-term impact. And some may not be very obvious here and now. At the same time, a lot of the impact, as we go through last week's session, you also noted that a lot of the impact are actually not necessarily physical in nature. In fact, physical injury is but just one impact. A lot of the impact that we have shared last week are injuries that are not so visible to our eyes, actually. A lot more psychological impact, a lot more emotional impact. So one key thing that we want to recognize is that it's not about the matter of abuse, it's not about the impact of abuse. Okay, it will never be okay. One other thing that I very commonly actually hear from people that I work with, I do not discount. I do not discount that there have been accounts that I've heard that people might think that they are engaging in certain abusive behavior because they want the best for the other person. They wanted to protect their loved one. And in the course of it, abusive behavior was being used. We would like to re-emphasize that the best intent does not excuse any form of violence. And something that I very often also hear, especially, I have to say, this I tend to hear a little bit more from people who tend to engage a little bit more in blaming themselves for what happened in the relationship. So for example, in female, who tends to come with the connotations that they tend to be naggy, female tends to be a little more naggy. I hear a lot of female telling me, oh, if only I stop nagging at him, I know that he doesn't like it. So if I nag at him, if I don't nag at him, he wouldn't have hit me. Okay. I also have heard people telling me, it's actually my fault. I shouldn't have cheated on her. So honestly, there's nothing I can say right now. I deserve whatever that she is doing to me right now because I was in the wrong first. So there are a lot of intent of people wanting to preserve that relationship, or people thinking that because they have done something wrong, they need to compensate, or they need to give in to the other person. But what we want to also mention is that in any healthy relationship, if you want to preserve that relationship, giving violence a space in your relationship is very often, if not always, not a good way to keep your relationship in a healthy state. So with that, I think I would like to move on a little bit more to what contributes to violence, which is a very, which is a very important aspect of today's session. From social media and general conversations that we tend to have as a society, I think our society has increased its non-acceptance of violence in healthy relationships. What I also tend to observe at the same time is people tend to think that violent acts are attributed to an individual flaw or deficit. So for the upcoming segment, right, I'd like to introduce to the audience today that there are actually a lot of factors than an individual's personality or behavior that can contribute to violence. Once again, while that does not excuse violence, why is it important for us to know what might have contributed to violence in this situation? It's because knowing what contributed to the usage of violence in any particular relationship is helpful for us to try to break out of the cycle by attending to some of the root contributing factors. Okay, so it's a bit heavy. I will try to go slower, hopefully. So if there's anything that you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box. I'll try to attend to them later on. Let's start with a frame of mind. In terms of thinking about contributing factor, there are, I would say, three key aspects. There's an individual aspect that I think a lot of us are familiar with. There is the relational aspect of contributing factor, And there's also the community, the societal aspect of contributing factors. So let's take a closer look to what does this mean. Um, Individual factors. This is non-exhaustive. These are some of the more common individual factors that I would think has a lot of influence on whether violent behaviors occur in a relationship. Like I mentioned, very often we hear people saying that he or she is a violent person. That's just the way he or she is. Very often what we also found sitting behind these behaviors, right, are some individual characteristics or challenges that manifested itself as abusive behavior. For example, for many of us, our life started in families. For most of us, we grew up in families. So there's something what we call the family of origin influence, the family that we grew up in. How does it influence us as an individual? Last week, Ting Ting kind of told us, and she ended the sessions with a very powerful video, which I really love. That video has been very, very impactful to show that for many families, when they experience or when they witness certain things that happens in their family, what usually happen is also they learn from it. They pick up certain behaviors that they observe in their family. So for influence from family of origin, we tend to find people, and I think I need to qualify over here. What we are saying, all these are factors that might influence, but by no means are we saying that any of all these factors will cause violent behavior necessarily. Okay, so with that, going back to the family of origin influence, if an individual grew up in a family where there are a lot of abuse going on, a lot of violence going on, the likelihood of these patterns perpetuating itself across generation, research has found to be quite high. Of course, with that said, why do I qualify to say that it's not always the case? Because we have also found that in certain individuals, the influence from the family actually has a positive influence. If they have grown up in a family where there's violence, there's abusive behavior, sometimes what happens for this individual is they make it a point that in their own family, as they grow up to be an adult, to set up their own family, that they avoid certain behaviors. But of course, it is easier said than done. Later on, as I cover more individual factors, you'll see how all these things comes together. So yeah, influence of origin, family of origin influence, whether have they witnessed all these things that's happening at home? Is this normal in their family? If that happens in uncle's family, in my granddad's family, in my grandma's family, this is something that's common in the family, the likelihood of it will be high. Okay. How does that also influence the next aspect of unhelpful worldview? Very often, the way that we look at the world, family is one key contributing factor. You also, of course, look at, as we are growing up, how do we interact with the world? Unhelpful worldview could come in the form of, let's say, for example, in today's context and in modern Singapore, gender views. Thinking that, for example, women are supposed to be submissive. You talking back to me is where you show that you are disrespectful towards me. Okay, so hence, I need to teach you a lesson. So of course, I have to admit that this is maybe a little bit more extreme, but I also have to unfortunately indicate that it's not as though that I have not heard all these statements before. So this is an example of how when an individual has very strong and unhelpful worldview pertaining to female-male roles, gender roles, pertaining to whether how do you take care of children, how do you parent children, including what do you do at home, what are the roles of the family. So this unhelpful worldview could actually also potentially increase the risk of someone adopting abusive behavior. With that, of course, they are not sequential. Some other individual factors include poor problem solving and coping skills. And we do actually tend to see that a lot in families where they have been exposed a lot to violence, because more often than not, it is where the family might not have found a more adaptive, a more helpful way of attending to their problems that has come up in their family situation or in relationships in general. So when there's poor problem solving, when there's difficulty in managing emotions, that actually increase the risk of someone using abusive behavior. When someone uses drugs and alcohol, when there's a habit of using drugs and alcohol, research has also found that that does actually disproportionately increase the risk of someone using abusive behavior, because we know that when we are under the influence of drug and alcohol, there's lesser inhibition, there's actually lesser control over our behavior as well. So that's one big cause. The other factor at the individual level is also where there are, and this is something that I also want to take this opportunity to make a disclaimer. We are not saying that people with mental health will be violent. That's not true. That's completely not true. That's a myth. In fact, we will tackle the myth the next session. But what happened for certain mental health condition, it might put the person at higher risk of engaging in abusive behavior. Okay, and last but not least, at the individual level, people who are facing, especially within a very short period of time, multiple stresses, and this is why potentially some of you might either witness it or at least read it on papers that this whole COVID-19 situation for the first half of the year, even up to today, has actually impacted many families, because many families suddenly are facing a lot of stress. And we have also read from the news that the number of family conflict and family violence reported has also increased in Singapore in the past half a year or so. Okay, so these are some of the common factors that we tend to find happening at the individual level. So let's take a look. Next, what's happening on the relationship level? And when we talk about relation level, that makes reference to what happens between the two persons. So whether you're married or not, so between you and your partner for this case. So when an individual steps into a relationship which presents significant relational challenges, it does increase the chances of an individual adopting unhelpful behavior. So last week we spoke about how when a person perceives themselves as being helpless, when they perceive themselves as losing control, there's a general tendency to attempt to take back control by exerting some power over the situation. Sometimes, unfortunately, this power can be abusive. It is important to recognize ultimately that it is still a choice to engage in violent behavior. So what do I mean by it's a choice? You were saying that lose of control, they want to get back control. So how does that make it a choice? If we were to pause a little bit, in most cases, not 100%, but in most cases of relational violence, they actually don't happen in public. They tend to happen in private space. Be it whether it is the victim or it is the perpetrator, people don't tend to talk about, hey, I hit my wife yesterday. I slapped my boyfriend earlier this morning. So you see that these are actually things that people are aware that it is not right. And people actually also make a distinction between, is this act permissible, or can they do this act here and now? So let me share a little bit more on that. Very often when I work with people, one of the common reflection was, wow, he seems like a very, very nice guy. He looks like a very caring boyfriend. I didn't expect him to be like this. Okay, so you see that if we talk about someone having anger issue, just now I talked about individual level, having anger issue and all, there is some level of choice and option over there, because you know that most people actually do not lash out relentlessly at every single person in every single setting. So they don't tend to lash out in public. They also don't tend to lash out on at people, for example, like their bosses at their workplace. So that's where there is a very important distinction to say that while they might, we can say that they are trying to exert control because they felt that they lose control over the situation, but they do maintain certain level of choices over there in terms of what they can do. Later on, when Tintin goes into breaking off the violent cycle, I hope that will give you a little bit of understanding to say that just because we are angry, it doesn't mean that is a reason for us to use violence. How can we break out of it? I'll leave that to Tintin later on. Okay, so When there are actually unhelpful communication pattern, the inability to resolve conflict effectively, and very often between two people who come together as a couple, when there are a lot of differing expectations and values, we do tend to actually see such relationship facing a higher risk of experiencing relationship violence. Okay. Aspect we are talking about community, societal aspect. So, what is culture norm? Think about it. How do the society, your family members, your peer groups perceive violence around you? Okay, so culturally, how we look at violence has a very strong influence on whether in a population, how prevalent, how common is violence existing in relationships. A quick example to say how cultural norms actually influence the propensity of abusive behavior. We think about it. Even in Singapore right now, the country is actually quite split in terms of using corporate punishment on children. But this is not always the case. As I was growing up, Kmarts, right? I have to admit, Kmarts, I get them pretty often, and the general attitude people around me is usually they think that I must have been naughty. No one digs an eyelid if they see multiple Kmarts on me. Okay, so that was the attitude of people back then. But if you think about right now, right, even though I said it's split, but even when people do not stop corporate punishment actively, they are more likely to control the intensity of corporate punishment. When they start to see a lot of Kmarts, they are more likely to check in with the parents to see, hey, is everything okay, or what happened over there, instead of taking a stand of, you did something bad, you deserve it, no question asked. So you see that we have actually shifted as a nation. And when that happened, there is generally more awareness of, in this case, child abuse, and there's more attention on what is acceptable or what's not acceptable, and people start adopting better way of parenting that might not necessarily just rely on cane as the only way to manage their child's behavior. So cultural norm plays a very big role. Okay. Willingness in addressing the issue. I'm not too sure if some of you might have caught some advertisement from the Ministry of Social and Family Development. A couple of years back, the team is actually on how saying that domestic violence, family violence is not a domestic affair. It is not an issue that is just behind closed door, that we do not intervene. So last week, when we talk about legislation, we also talk about, I remember one particular comment. I'm not too sure if the audience is with us tonight. There was an audience who said, is there use calling the police? Because people have said that it's useless. Okay, so the willingness as a society to address violence in relationship is also very important for us to reduce the occurrence of such situations in relationships. Okay, so the last but not least is on the availability of network support. The legislations in terms of how is support relevant. For example, I was sharing last week that our legislation actually keeps up with things that's happening in the society. So maybe a quick example to say how legislation actually can better protect us in the community. As recent as only this year, our law has actually revised the age of minor from 16 to 18 years old. Okay, so as compared to the past, 16 years old when my parents are growing up, it might be an age where people have already finished study, they head out to work, or maybe they didn't even study, they head out to work. Whereas in today's context, right, many 16 years old are still under the care of their parents, hence the need for protection. So when a society, including the law, is able to say, hey, this is unacceptable in our society, the law says so, that actually also reduce the likelihood of relationship facing violence. Okay, yeah, my system is back up right now. So the last bit is on support network, and this include both formal and informal. Are there enough people out there to support you when violence happen, whether you are the one using or you might be the one receiving violence? if there are people around you who actually are willing to support you and say that, hey, don't worry, whatever that, I mean, we are with you on this. This is not something that we will let you handle all by yourself. When there are such factors in the community around you, it's more likely that such behaviors will stop, as compared to if generally there's no such network support. Okay. The next slides that we're going to look at looks at, so some people might actually say, okay, Yanning, I hear what you have just said, but honestly, some of these things may not be able to change overnight, or even change it, or some of the things that you're saying are like, I don't even see the things changing in the near future. So why don't people just leave abusive relationship? I'm not going to go too in depth today because, as I mentioned, we're going to cover myths next week, and we're going to have a much deeper dialogue next week. And that will cover how come some people actually find it hard to leave a relationship. But for today, kind of just a little bit of a highlight of more common reasons that kept people in a relationship that might not be healthy, and in this case, abusive. One very common situation that we tend to find is awareness. Sometimes, why did we go through last week? We spent an hour talking about what is violence. The reality is, actually, sometimes people do not recognize that they are in an abusive relationship. They do not know that this is called violence. Okay. For certain individuals, there's a sense of guilt and responsibility. Just now, I cited examples to say that if only I didn't do this, if only I did better. So it's my fault. They are not aware that actually no behavior, no matter what you have done, it doesn't warrant a violent treatment. Okay, that awareness, that to really just take these two things as separated. Okay, lack of understanding of healthy relationship, not being able to see that things can actually be different. Okay, there are also people who actually carries hope for changes. Don't give up. Things might change. It doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't happen all the time. I've heard that a lot of time in many relationships. Last week we covered the cycle of violence. If you recall, the cycle of violence talks about how when there's violence in a relationship, it generally takes the form of honeymoon, tension building, and explosion. So with that, right, whenever there's the non-explosive period, people tend to see the goodness in the relationship, the good thing that happens between the two of them. So it anchors, it strengthens that belief that actually it really doesn't happen all the time. Our relationship for most time are actually good, other than that moment. So that makes it difficult for some people to actually walk away from relationships that might not be healthy. Okay. Expectations. Of course, there are a lot of all these expectations, but one more common expectation that I tend to hear is this fear of not having a relationship after that. That they feel that they have to keep up a front, that they first and foremost they have to be in a relationship, and not only that, that the relationship has to be perfect. There has to be I can't tell my family that my boyfriend hits me because otherwise they might do something to him. Okay, I cannot let people know that. Okay, so there are a lot of all this self-imposed expectation, and I kind of leave it to the last, but definitely not the least. In fact, it's one of the strongest indicator for many people who chose, no, maybe let me retract myself. I wouldn't use the word choose, who finds it hard to leave relationship. It's on this idea of survival. Many aspects of it, cite two aspects for this evening. First one is especially when they are children. They find that if, let's say, I were to leave this relationship, my children would lose a parent. We will have a non-intact family. And in certain family, and this might be a little bit more relevant for female, especially if they are not working, there tends to be a lot of dependency financially on their partner. So if they were to lose this relationship, they step out of this relationship and they have kids, there's a lot of concern of, I've been out of work for so long, can I go back to work? And even if I can go back to work, can I earn enough for myself and for my children? Do I have enough money to pay for a house? My children, sometimes if let's say I don't have enough money to support my children, will I lose the custody of my children? And these are very real concerns for actually many parents. Yeah, so that is a very real fear that they tend to have if they were ever to step out of this relationship. Another fear that's linked to survivor is this idea of death. In fact, research both locally and more prominently overseas has shown that leaving a relationship does not necessarily stop the violence. And our law does actually kind of suggest that as well. Later on, Tintin will talk a little bit more about the personal protection order. But in terms of even personal protection order, it doesn't only cover husband and wife, but it also cover ex-spouses, which is a very important message that the legislation is telling us that even if you have ceased your relationship as husband and wife, you are not allowed to engage in violent behavior. So, kind of unfortunate, but I think taking my last couple of seconds for my segment to share with all of you, this death thing is a real concern. This is a recent article. I think some of you might be familiar with it. We had a recent case where someone was a death was sentenced. I highlighted some of the key points. It's not exactly the same, but this is where when individual feels that they might lose their family, sometimes it can actually prompt people to take very extreme and drastic measure. So in this particular case, what happened for the father was he was extremely distressed. I mean, aside from we don't know the full story, but based on the article, one of the factors that actually was stressing him out was he was afraid that his wife might not let him see their children, their daughter after divorce. And what unfortunately happened was he decided, in order not to lose his child, he decided to take his child with him. He survived. Unfortunately, the child did not survive. But once again, this is an illustration to say that leaving a relationship does not necessarily stop the violence. And because of this information, sometimes it does lead to people not taking further action in their relationship. So to sum it all up, ultimately, we want to be able to promote a non-violent approach in a relationship where there is more equality. So that's my segment on contributing factor. I'm going to pass the time over to Ting Ting, who will be sharing with all of you a little bit more about, now that we know all these things, how do we break out of a violent relationship? So Ting Ting, over to you.
Yep, thank you, Yanling. Yanling, can you hear me, right? Okay, over to here. Okay, right. So, as Yanling was mentioning, this second part of this today's session, we're going to be talking a bit, quite a lot about how do we break out of violence, how do we keep ourselves and everyone around us safe. So, maybe just a quick overview. When we say breaking out of violence, these are the three main things we're looking at. So, firstly, will be awareness of triggers and stressors. Secondly, violence prevention plan, and last but not least, and the ultimate goal, hopefully, we're looking at is to use alternative non-violent ways to manage emotions and conflict. So maybe for just a quick introduction, when we say stresses, I think Yanling has mentioned quite a bit just now. So it can be things like not being able to hold on to a job, problems at work, problems with other relatives. It can be anything, in fact. Yeah, anything that adds um, not so good emotions to the person, which can eventually lead the person to use violent behaviors. Yeah. So when we say triggers, it's even looking is really looking at what happens prior to the violence, just right before the violence. Yeah. So is there something that will make the person get really angry very fast? And then the person can't manage emotions, which leads to conflict. So, example, is it talking about certain topics, or is it engaging in certain behaviors which makes the perpetrator very angry? Yeah, for whichever reason that maybe Yanning would have mentioned earlier. Yeah, so we are saying that if we kind of can predict, not say predict, but we know the pattern, is really we probably need to sit down and think about really what happens before the violence. So if we know what happens before then and we see it happening, can we stop it from going into really violent behavior? That's what we are saying here in terms of awareness of triggers and stresses. Yeah. Okay, in terms of violence prevention plan, I'm going to go into it a little bit more very soon. We're looking at a few things. So first step would be really safety plans that we think about even before the violence happens. Yeah. And then the two other things that we're going to look at later is really how do we keep ourselves safe after violence immediately and maybe for a period of time after that? Yeah, and what's the long-term plan to keep everyone safe? Yeah, so that's for violence prevention plan. Lastly, we're going to, but this one, okay, the last part I will say first is a very, very big topic that we can't do justice in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah, so we're just going to be talking about it very briefly, but it's really looking at using other ways to manage conflict. Yeah, even though a lot of times I think a lot of us might have the very, so not say automatic lah, but very quick thinking to say that, oh, you know, when things happen, we get violent, and then we get angry. Sorry, see, we get angry until we become violent. Yeah, so it does not have to happen that way. Yeah. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, violence prevention plan, there's 3 things we're going to be talking about. So first thing, safety planning, really the what happens before the violence actually takes place. Place of safety and personal protection order, domestic exclusion order, these 2 things are for kind of what happens after the violence, but the short-term and the long-term plan to keep everyone safe. Yeah. Okay, so first up, we are talking about okay, safety planning for victims. So this is really what we, in the course of our work, we always tell a lot of our clients who come over and talk to us and say, oh, they are facing a violent situation. So this is usually what we kind of guide them to do or suggest that they can do. So first thing would be getting ready a bag with essential items. When we say essential items, we are referring to things like NRIC, of course, handphone, passport, and other important documents that the person might need. Yeah, or any other items that the person might need. Yeah, for daily living. And then this bag has to be kept somewhere which is, of course, not known to the perpetrator. Yeah. Okay, but of course, I mean, what we are saying here is that it's not really to say we want to, you know, just keep a secret and then just run away whenever anything happens. But it's really just to make sure that everyone is safe. Yeah. So that's the really that's the bottom line here. Yeah. Okay. Secondly, ensuring mobile phone is always ready. So meaning sometimes we get too engrossed, we use our phone all the time, and then we forget to charge our phone, right? But then sometimes when crisis happens, we really do not have the time to react. It's really just calling for help immediately. And imagine your mobile phone is dead. Oh no, then yeah, it's going to be very challenging in terms of getting help to come forward. Yeah. The third one, being aware of triggers. So like I mentioned earlier, so what really happens before the violence? So one example I can think of, which we also see quite often when we work with our clients, is this thing about really alcohol, drinking alcohol. So because we know that drinking alcohol sometimes really help, not say sometimes, it makes a person kind of lose their sense of judgment a little bit. And I think emotionally, they can feel a bit more vulnerable. So that's where sometimes violence happens quite easily. Yeah. So if, for instance, everyone in the family notices that the perpetrator comes home and then is drunk or is like drinking alcohol, so it might really be a sign to say that, okay, stay away from the perpetrator for now. Yeah, not to say avoid or purposely like you know, go and make him angry or what, but it's really keeping safe. The idea here is really keeping safe. Yeah. Next, we are talking about calling the police. I know last week there was a question posed about calling police, you know, what if it doesn't work and stuff like that. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about PPO in a while. But for this part, we are saying calling the police and informing about critical information, such as like where do you stay, what has happened, are there any injuries on you, yeah, and stuff like that. So critical information so that police can come immediately. Yeah, so it's also we must also know what to tell the police lah. Yeah, when we call. Yeah. I think we are go to this first. So exercising your PPO for clients who, or for anyone who has a personal protection order, is also very critical when calling the police to inform that you do have a PPO. Yeah. So then there is so-called this legislation to let the police know that, okay, I have a protection order, and then they can come immediately to help you to manage the situation and even to bring the perpetrator away from the environment. Yeah. Okay, going back to the previous point, it's also important to build a help network which can activate the police if needed. So what we are referring to here is like letting a family member know or letting a friend know, or yeah, so that they can know what is the code word. For instance, if you text them and say, oh, help, or say text them like now, so then they will know to help you to call the police or call for any help. Yeah, in the event that you really can't pick up the phone and just do a call. Yeah. Okay, so these are very important things to note. Last but not least, being prepared with backup plans beforehand. What we are saying here is very importantly, knowing where to go in the event that violence happens. Yeah. So it can be letting a friend or family member know that, oh, if anything happens and I need to leave the house immediately, I'll give you a call and I will just turn up. Please take me in. Yeah. So it's letting the person who is going to help you know and be prepared beforehand. Yeah. Okay, so the second part in terms of safety planning, we're looking at two things here. First would be temporary place of safety. So like I mentioned earlier, family and friends, that will usually be a better option in terms of a temporary place of safety. But if for any reason, family and friends are not able to support, or if let's say, sometimes we also hear that there are victims who are afraid that going to family or friends might implicate them, which is a very real concern as well. So we sometimes will look into finding a crisis shelter for the victim to stay. But I have to say here, because due to confidentiality reasons, we can't share too much information about crisis shelters. But what we can say that is really a very safe place where the victim can stay for a period of, say, a few months, where eventually the goal is to have the person return back maybe to home or to another place, meaning maybe a friend or a family's place. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Last but not least, PPO and DEO. This one, a lot of information. Okay, let me do this. So, the personal protection order is really order, sounds very self-explanatory, to protect yourself, and the protection order can also include your family members like children. Yeah. So okay. I mean, applying for this, it can either be done at the court itself or at any family violence specialist center. Yeah. So the idea is that once the victim obtains the order, it says that the perpetrator is not supposed to use any form of violence on the victim. So it can be things like maybe threats, verbal violence, or physical violence. And confinement. Yeah, so these are the few areas that's being covered. But I think, of course, what we want to say here is that while we want to activate the PPO when it's needed, like for example, when there's a crisis situation, we also want to avoid talking about it all the time, or like bringing it to say, oh, I have a PPO, you don't think of doing anything against me. Yeah, because the reality is that it can sometimes be quite provoking instead. Yeah, so it can lead to unnecessary conflict, which can in the end lead to violence, which is what we do not want to happen. Yeah. Never mind, let me go to DEO first. So DEO is usually an added on order to PPO. So there's no sole domestic exclusion order by itself. It's usually PPO is applied, and then the victim can consider putting on a domestic exclusion order. So what is this? It's actually an order to say, for instance, maybe it's actually basically to limit the physical environment. So it can order that maybe the perpetrator is not allowed to enter, say, maybe the victim's room or any parts of the house. But this one is it can be worked out. The victim can actually say which are the areas that the perpetrator is not allowed to enter in the house. Or worst case scenario, we have seen the domestic exclusion order can be applied to the whole unit. So meaning the perpetrator is not allowed to enter the house at all. Yeah. Why we indicate here mandatory counselling program is that usually when the personal protection order is given by the court, what accompanies it is the mandatory counselling program. So both the victim and the perpetrator will be ordered to undergo counselling. It can happen at the specialist centers, the family violence specialist centers, or even at the family service centers itself. Right. Okay. Sorry. I remember what I wanted to say about PPO. So because a lot of families that we see, they do still hope to maintain the relationship, and the PPO itself can be a very impactful decision on the marriage per se. Like if because it's a married couple, so it can impact on the marital relationship. Yeah, so it's really that's why eventually I think the goal is we hope to look at how to help the couple through counselling, through the mandated counselling, work out how to respond to one another, to each other in non-violent ways. Yeah. Okay.
Now to jump in
Yeah.
at this moment, I think how come we wanted to do contributing factor is also to illustrate that things that Tintin is sharing right now is kind of like happening there and then. How do you keep yourself safe when there's violence occurring? But through the contributing factor, you might have a sensing that actually a lot of all these things are really not things that you can change there and then immediately overnight. And hence, a lot of times the counseling orders are also in place for them to tackle some of these more deep-rooted issues, be it happening at the individual, the relational, or the community level. Yeah, so I just want to add on to say that how all these things can be attended to over time through counseling. So back to you, thinking.
Okay, so the next part, just going to run through very quickly, safety planning for children. This is a sample of a safety plan done by a child. So usually what we do is that we sit down with the child and say, okay, what are the different areas in the house? So get the child to draw out what is how can they run out from the house, for instance, if they are facing violent situations at home. Yeah, so hence you see all the arrows, the primary path. The secondary path, Yan Ling was telling me, you have to explain that they don't just jump out the window. Yeah, okay. So yeah, disclaimer here. Okay, unless it's maybe story one, but yeah, okay. But in all seriousness, it's really helping the child to really know the environment well. And as you see, there's a tree there that says meet here. So in the event that the child knows that he or she needs to run out from the house, where is the next place to go? Is it going to a relative's house, or is it going to the coffee shop downstairs to look for a certain uncle? Or yeah, I mean, it can be anything. Yeah. So of course, we have to say that disclaimer is that this is probably for children who are slightly older, who are cognitively able to absorb this. Yeah. Okay, so last but not least, we are also talking about safety planning for perpetrators. Yeah. Firstly, is really being aware of one's triggers and reactions to them. So perpetrators can know that, what is it that makes them really angry, what makes them lose their control of their emotions at that moment, and what do they normally do when they lose control. So the first thing we always say is it's important to have awareness of what is happening to yourself. Yeah. Then secondly, it'll be a good thing to do to really call for timeout and remove one from scene. So we always say, walk away, walk away, walk away. Yeah. So this is not the long-term solution, but we are saying that this is the immediate solution that will help to de-escalate any emotions that you have. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it'd be good to at least be away from the place for about 30 minutes or so to give yourself time to cool down. Yeah. So the thing which is related is you have to let the other person step away and without pursuing the person, because we know that sometimes when we get angry, emotions are very high, and we sometimes just want to prove our point. Then it can happen like this, like, hey, you come back, you don't go away, we haven't finished the argument, no, come back. Yeah, but we do know that if this happens and it carries on, it can lead to violence. Yeah. So rather than letting that happen, it's better to let the other person go away. And then you can always come back to talk about the issue when both are feeling calmer. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the next one, just now we said we have to have, victims should have like a safety plan beforehand. This is the same thing for perpetrators. Perpetrators should also have their own support system. So for instance, when they get angry and then they not too sure what to do, then it's good to also let them have this idea, that, they can call a friend, they can call a family member, they can just do something to help to manage their emotions or their stress level. Yeah. So I think what we're saying here is that we're not saying that, oh no, nobody can get angry. No, I think that's not what we're saying here. But it's really how do we think about better ways to manage this anger. Yeah. Last but not least, this is a very important reminder because we sometimes we know that when we get angry or we get emotional, people might turn to alcohol or sometimes even drugs to just help themselves to feel calmer. But again, as we have been saying, this engagement in alcohol and drugs can actually lead to the violence happening. Yeah. So just a gentle reminder here to stay away from substances during timeout or during times of anger and frustration. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as we were saying, right? So the main goal, hopefully, for everyone to work towards is really to think about non-violent ways to manage emotions and conflict. So we just want to say here that abusive behaviors are learned behaviors which can be unlearned. So like the earlier part about in Yeling sharing, we were saying how does the person eventually become violent? There are lots of factors. So if let's say the many factors that happen in that person's life cause him or her to really learn such violent ways to manage problems, then there can also be ways to unlearn and then learn new ways to manage problems which are not violent. Yeah. Yes, so it's being able to recognize that there are non-violent approaches towards difficulties. But last but not least, we want to emphasize if it becomes a really difficult situation to manage, it's always good to seek out professional support to help the family to look at a different way to attending to each other's needs. Yeah, because we were saying that because this violent behavior also has a certain cause or a certain not say reason, but a lot of things, a lot of factors come together to contribute to this violent behavior. So if let's say it's because of someone's needs who are not met in the family, then can we look at this together with a professional to really see what's going on in the family? Yeah. So meaning is to say we are trying to address the root of the problem here. Yeah. Okay, so this part, we did mention this last week a little bit also. So this is for those of us who might find that or might come to realize that someone like a friend or family member might be in a violent situation. So first thing we want to say is really to listen and to provide support and not to judge. So I think we have to avoid saying things like, "Aiya, just leave lah. Why you don't want to leave?" Like the part that Yan was sharing earlier, like some of the things that we always think about, like why is it that people don't want to leave violent relationships? Yeah. So we have to be very mindful not to make such statements, but really just to listen and provide support. Yeah. Secondly, it's also to give affirmation. Why? Because in a lot of families that we work with, a lot of victims that I work with, they do manage a lot of things in their family situation, not just the violent part. Usually there's a lot of other stresses and a lot of things that adds on to the frustration. So I think we also want to give them affirmation to say that they have been really managing to the best of their ability and it's for a long time. Yeah. Okay. Thirdly, is providing information on help available. So what we could do is also to equip ourselves with knowledge, like where can they seek help from, what is the best thing to do, or so it's really giving the information and then letting the person know that, hey, this is the help that's available. You can think about it and go for it when you're ready. Yeah. And last but not least, you can even say that I can go with you to seek help. Yeah. So it's really giving the real practical support here. Now we are down to the Q&A segment. Could we get Ashley to bring up the questions and we can try to answer them?
Okay. Actually, I did have. I just received a question. I will not name this individual because it was a private message. Yeah. So I understand that someone had personal property. Someone was asking, what if the abuser has my personal property? Okay. So I think ultimately, I'm not too sure about your relationship with the person who kept your things. But ultimately, recognizing that you do actually have your rights to your personal property. So if you have your personal property being kept by someone else, potentially you might want to consider making a police report if, let's say, the communication between you and the person has broken down, that you're not able to engage in be it direct communication or through another mutual friend or mutual support. If you're not able to get this person to discuss this further, then you do reserve the right to bring this up to the police if you think that this is something that is important to you. Yeah. So of course, with that said, I think it very much depends on your relationship with this individual and what's the purpose of this person doing that. So without knowing too much, I think I'll keep it as you do have the right to communicate, if not, make a police report. We have a question from Devon. Hi, what happens if a person breach a PPA or DO? Okay, I think that's a very common situation. Okay, unfortunately, that's a little bit common. We wished. Do you want to share a little bit with the audience what can likely happen?
Okay. We have also come across, like what Yanni said, quite a number of times we have heard that people breaching the orders. What happens is the police can be called in. The perpetrator can be, I think, a variety of scenarios here. I think one thing to look at would be the severity of the breach here. So the perpetrator could be placed in lockup for a few days and then later on can be allowed to go home. But we have also seen perpetrators who are brought back to court, and charged in court, and they could end up in jail. Actually, they could end up incarcerated. Yeah.
Mm. So I think it's also important to note that when someone breaches a PPO, the police will do their own investigation, and they would reserve the right to decide whether to charge this person or not. So if they decide to charge this person, then it's not something, because sometimes we hear people saying that, oh, he forced me to remove the police case, withdraw the police case. So ultimately, there are different processes to it. If the police decides to charge, it would be between them and the AGC, the Attorney Chamber. So that would be the legislation in Singapore. I received another message that seems to follow up on my earlier comment on the police making a police report. So I think what I'd like to highlight to this individual is while I talk about communication, talking to this person, but ultimately, just now Tintin also talk about are these trigger points. If you realize that it is more likely than not that this might stir up further conflict and potentially actually violence where there's exchange of physical contact, then it might not necessarily be a very wise thing to confront that person. So I might suggest that for the person who popped me that question, do it in a safe place. If let's say there's a trusted third party, maybe have the third party to be there to support, to also help the person to manage their emotions, especially if the other person actually gets very aggravated or agitated. Yeah, so would not suggest that you all do video recording, etc. So that might actually stir people up. Yeah. Okay, let me just take a moment. I just received another message. Let me see. Okay, this audience, if you don't mind, I'm going to read it out so that audience knows what question I'm answering. Hi, may I know if being forced to live with spouse family in our home is considered abuse? My spouse threatened to leave me if I cannot live with his family member in our own home. Okay. I would say if we are looking at outright domestic violence, PPO coverage, we might not have a very clear-cut case in these situations where it's more of family conflict. Quite clearly, this can be difficult for the audience who asked this question. I might suggest that you might want to consider approaching a counselor, a marriage counselor, to talk about how can you express your need to your family member. And of course, you said that my spouse threatened to leave me. I think it's a decision that you probably would need some time and some processing to think about if this is a repeated pattern, especially when your spouse use leaving as a way of controlling you. Is this a relationship that you think you are able to withstand if no changes happen? We hope that through marital counseling, your spouse can also be willing to consider other way of communicating aside from threatening to leave the relationship. Yeah, so you might want to consider, especially if you notice this as a very typical pattern. I can consider this as an unhelpful and potentially abusive relationship. Tini, MCP, we have a question from KT on the group chat.
Yeah. Okay. So usually for mandatory counseling, we are looking at between 4 to 6 sessions in a period of 6 months. Because there's usually a review back at the court to look at the progress of the counseling. Yeah. What was the other question?
What's usually done?
Oh, okay. So it can be done in a few ways. I mean, what I meant was that it could be done separately for victim and perpetrator, or if let's say there is a plan for the relationship to be reconciled, then there would be sessions where it's done together for victim and perpetrator. But I think we are really looking at doing the sessions together in a very safe environment. So if we do think that maybe the couple might not be ready to work together at a point in time, so we might be continue with individual sessions. What is covered is a lot of there's a lot of topics. So it can be things like recognizing what's violence, understanding what's violence. It can be also things like managing conflict in a healthy manner. Also, what else?
Maybe if I'm largely, there are two objectives when people are being referred for counseling program. The first objective is cessation of violence. So we need to make sure that no one continues to use violence in this particular family. If there is continuation of usage of violence, then that's where we will actually support the victim or the affected people to take further action. Through the PPO that they have secured. How do they use it? So which is important to know how to use it. Once the violence has been ceased, then of course, earlier on we talk about contributing factor, and that's usually one of the big areas that we cover, because ultimately we didn't want it to just stop there because the law says you cannot. We hope because they are family, by addressing some of these factor underlying situations, the family member stands a better chance of living life without feeling the need for violence to exist, and hopefully actually adopting more positive way of communicating and conflict resolution. So that's what usually we will cover in such programs. Yeah. So sometimes people will ask, but we are already divorcing. Do we still need to attend? The ultimate goal is really more of supporting the individuals. It is not a marriage reconciliation program. So whichever your decision is, we wanted to make sure that going forward, if you even intend to step into another relationship, how can you better protect yourself and people around you? Yeah. So thinking, I'm looking at time. Now we are at 9:05. So thank you, everyone. I thought maybe we could maybe round it up if there's no further question for this evening. So those are very good questions. Like we mentioned, we probably can't go very in-depth, but if let's say you are interested to maybe because next week what's going to happen is we're going to have myth dispelling, and we're also going to cover some scenarios. So in fact, some of the things that you all have brought up, like for example, what do I do if this happened? We will actually be doing some scenario play out as well. So feel free to join us next week if you're available on Wednesday. Very, very quick comment to Katie. If they refuse the mandatory counseling, I will have to say that's between them and the court, because it's a court order. So if they refuse to attend the counseling, then during the court date, they will have to explain to the court, the judge, how come they did not turn up. Yeah, then the judge will have to decide how he or she likes to take on someone who did breach the order. Okay. Kiawan posted something. My partner just hit me, call it self-defense. Kiawan, I hope that you are safe over there. If you are currently having any injury, please seek medical treatment. Please seek help as well. Call it self-defense. I think that's one of the key things that we have emphasized in our session. There's no consideration for intent. If let's say you have actually hit up on your partner before your partner retaliate, I would encourage you to maybe consider alternative of coping. I don't think it would be fair for me to just give you the answer here and now. It's a complicated process. If you did not hit, but your partner hit you and call it self-defense, I think the law is very clear on that. Intent is not part of considering what is domestic violence. Yeah. So with that, I will quickly pass on the time back to Ting Ting to cover whatever you might have to cover next.
Okay, just very quickly. Okay, so if you have any further questions or you would like to speak to us further, feel free to contact us at our email, contact@viria.org.sg, or call us at our helpline, 62561311. Yep. Okay, so again, we just want to highlight these are the few helplines that are available. But of course, if you are in immediate danger, please call the police at 999 or call ambulance at 995 lah. Or if there's any help that you need, you could always approach the A&E department of your nearest hospital. Yeah. But just to note that these are the few helplines here. These are the ones that focus on family violence. So they are the family violence specialist centers. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll suggest if let's say not that you need it necessarily, but if you do know someone who needs it, maybe you can take your mobile phone, take a picture of this, and keep it somewhere in your phone that you can potentially share with people who might need it.
Okay. Again, we want to sell a bit of koyo here. No. So, okay, we're going to have a special dialogue about violence next week. It's going to be a little bit different from the past 2 sessions. So we really hope to see you back with us again. But just to note, it's on 16 December. It's a Wednesday instead of the usual Tuesday. Yeah. You can sign up at the link that's listed here. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just to share with you again, this is my mental health website. So there are a lot of resources over here at this website to help us to learn to manage our well-being, manage our mental health a bit better. Yeah. So feel free to check out this website. Okay. Last but not least, thank you very much for being with us today. Please help us to do this very quick feedback form so we can look at it and see how we could maybe implement some of the suggestions for the next session. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Sorry that we overran a little bit, but we hope that you find the session helpful. Do give us your feedback and see how we can maybe bring some of these ideas for next session, especially if you're joining us. Stay safe, everyone. So have a good evening. Take care.